Hello, boys and girls. How are you doing? Welcome back from spring break. So, if you'll notice, I'm wearing my glasses now. I have run out of contacts, and so they're taking a little while to get here. The mail and shipping sometimes a little bit slower now because of everything that's going on. So, so you get to see me in my glasses right now. So Peter Nimble. Do you remember when we left off? He was in the palace and everything was perfect, except they were eating dinner, and all of a sudden, everybody kind of panicked and they had to run back to Mrs. Molasses's room or house, whatever it is that she's in. And she tucked him in and acted like everything was okay, but he could hear all of them being locked in. And remember, he was a little concerned with kind of what was going on. He felt like something else was happening, but he couldn't figure it out. So we're on chapter 15, A Chat with Pickle. I'm not real happy with how this is set up today. I may just have to hold it. I don't like holding it, but I think that's better. Okay. A Chat with Pickle. And it looks to me like, I know it's backwards for you, but it looks like Pickle's a bird. Okay. Not 10 minutes after Mrs. Molasses had extinguished the lights and glided off to her bedroom, Peter discovered for himself what had so frightened all the people at supper. There was a monster in the palace. He could hear it in the corridors outside. It moved with a terrible scraping, clinking, shuffling sound that seemed to echo on forever. Its voice was even worse, a hollow, miserable wail that curdled Peter's stomach and turned his arms to goose flesh. He listened, pulling the covers tight around his body. Was this what he'd come to save them from? If there was one thing Peter found even more disturbing than the awful noises outside, it was the fact that Mrs. Molasses was sound asleep in the next room. There was no way she couldn't hear the horrible monster just outside her door. And yet she was peacefully dreaming the night away in her perfectly made bed. The boy supposed that after enough time a person could grow accustomed to anything, no matter how loud it growled and moaned and rattled and roared. Peter, however, had far too many questions to even think about sleeping. He decided it would be best to go investigate. I would not go investigate. Why would you go investigate when there is a big monster out there? From the king's extreme security precautions, it was clear that the monster was very, very dangerous. Otherwise, those giant deadbolts wouldn't be necessary. If only I had my fishhook, he thought for the 100th time that night. He had already checked his bedroom for something that might make a weapon, but the best he could do was a throw pillow. Peter tucked the box of fantastic eyes under one arm and crept into the foyer. When he reached the front door, he knelt down and placed his ear against its surface. Through the metal, he could hear 100 shuffling footsteps. Was it a giant centipede? No, Peter could now make out that what he had thought to be one horrible noise was actually a chorus of dozens, all grunting, moaning, and wheezing. The boy waited patiently until the monster, or monsters, had disappeared around the corner, and then he set to work. Oh no. For Peter, as we know, the average deadbolt lock, though tricky, was hardly insurmountable. But the lock on Mrs. Molasses' front door was far from average. The mechanism was made of thrice tempered steel and reinforced by gears in the doorframe. Who would make a door that locks on both sides? He wondered quietly. Since waking up in the palace, the boy had been spending more and more time talking out loud to himself like this. While for some people that may be a sign of madness, for Peter it was more a sign of loneliness. The boy knew that without the proper tools, he couldn't open the door, which meant he would have to find another way out of the house. He could find no windows along the front wall, but he did notice a faint breeze blowing out from beneath Mrs. Molasses' bedroom door. He turned the handle and slipped inside. Mrs. Molasses was asleep in her bed. Peter could hear the woman tossing her head, caught up in some kind of nightmare. "No," she groaned. "Give him back! Give him back!" The master thief moved to the far wall of the room and searched for the source of the draft. The air was coming through a screen door that opened onto a small courtyard. He stepped outside, taking extra care not to disturb Mrs. Molasses as he passed. The temperature in the courtyard was mild. Perfect, really. Peter paused, enjoying the moonlight against his skin. "This must be the yard where Mrs. Molasses found me," he said to himself. Getting out of the perfumed house meant that he could finally use his nose again. He took a long, deep breath. He could smell Sir Toad. Peter raced to the center of the yard and pressed his nose against the cold stones. There was a bit of dried blood in the mortar cracks. Some of it belonged to Peter. Some of it belonged to Sir Toad. "We both made it across," he whispered, almost afraid to speak his hope aloud. "But how did we get separated?" He studied the ground for more clues. He could feel chips in the stone where they had both landed. There were a few scattered raven feathers that must have come over with them when they transported. Then farther along, he could smell a third person. Someone had snuck up on them. This person smelled filthy, even worse than the prisoners of the just deserts. Peter followed the trail to reconstruct what had happened. The stranger had tried to take Peter's burgle sack, but there had been a struggle, because Sir Toad must have been inside it. The stranger was too fast, though, and managed to restrain the knight, running off to... where? Peter followed the scent, but couldn't tell where the kidnapper had gone. It was as though Sir Toad and the stranger had simply disappeared. Somewhere in the distance, a vicious snarl shook the air. The sound filled Peter with new dread. For all he knew, one of those monsters had captured his friend. If so, he only hoped that the creature was keeping Sir Toad alive for the time being. Then at least there was a chance Peter could save him. He ran to the low walls surrounding the courtyard. From the howling wind below, he could tell the other side was a steep drop. He tossed a pebble over the edge and listened as it fell and fell and fell. This palace must overlook the same chasm as the just deserts, he said, only on the other side. "Of course it does," a tiny voice replied. Peter spun around, balling his fists. The voice was so faint that even Peter's incredible ears had trouble making out the source. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'll give you 3 guesses. Now move your bloomin' foot so I can get on with my doodling." Peter crouched down and felt along the base of the wall. "Hey, hands off, you big bully!" the voice shouted. Peter scooped up a tiny beetle, hiding in a crack of the mortar. "It's you that's talking, isn't it? You're a talking beetle." "Oh, well done," the beetle clicked. "What tipped you off?" Peter was still too young to understand that the beetle, who was rather irritated at being snatched up, was making fun of him by employing a bit of sarcasm. "I just listened to where your voice was coming from," the boy explained. "I have very sensitive ears." "Oh, well, ain't that special? Supposing you want a prize now? Listen, I don't go snatching you up in my pinchers all willy-nilly, so how's about you do the same and put me back down?" I'm sorry, it's just that I'm a little lost. I'm new here and I need to find a friend of mine. I think he was kidnapped by a monster." "Sure, I seen him," the beetle said. "Big, ugly bloke in a bag. Snatched up by some other big, ugly blokes. A real brawl that was, hissing and flapping and such. Thought they were gonna up and squash me, I did." Peter's stomach lurched as his worst fears about Sir Toad were confirmed. "Then what happened?" he begged. "Where did they go?" "Honestly, I don't pay mind to you bigs all that much. Soon as I was clear stomping distance, I just went back to me work. Speaking of tut," and with that, the grumpy beetle hopped from Peter's palm and scuttled away. Peter stood back up. "Well, that was a perfectly useless conversation," he said with a sigh. Now there is a wonderful thing in this world called foresight. It is a gift treasured above all others because it allows one to know what the future holds. Most people with foresight end up wielding immense power in life, often becoming great rulers or librarians. Sadly, Peter, being a 10-year-old boy, was built without any capacity for foresight, and so he continued walking, unaware of how his chance encounter with a grumpy insect would prove to be nothing short of transformational. Though unimpressed by the beetle, Peter wondered whether it might be worth seeking out some friendlier, more observant animals to question. He remembered the little birds singing in the eating hall during supper. Maybe they could tell him about the monsters, or even Sir Toad. He took up the box of fantastic eyes and started for the main corridor. Is he really going to walk through the palace with the monsters out there? Seriously? Seriously, Peter? Mrs. Molasses' courtyard was cut off from the main palace, but Peter had little trouble scaling the ivy-covered walls. Soon he was standing on an open bridge that, if he recalled correctly, would lead him straight to the center of the palace. He retraced his route from earlier in the day, taking care to stay clear of the monsters pacing the hallways. Every so often he would hear them moving nearby. There would be a sharp cracking sound followed by 100 horrid moans as the creatures slinked down this or that corridor. It sounded to Peter like they were also working their way toward the eating hall. "Then I'd better hurry," he murmured, redoubling his speed. "Or how about go back to Mrs. Molasses? If they're headed to there, why would he want to get there?" Peter reached the broad passage that connected to the eating hall. He sprinted ahead, but halfway down its length, he ran smack into a series of flat iron bars. The boy fell backward, dropping his box of fantastic eyes, which clattered noisily against the stones. He climbed to his feet and reached forward. The obstruction, which had not been there during the day, was part of a gate that cut off the eating hall from the rest of the palace. He ran his fingers along the edge, deducing that the gate was controlled by the same clockwork that locked Mrs. Molasses' front door. Though Peter was an accomplished contortionist, he could tell straight away that the gaps were too narrow for him to pass through. The situation was infuriating. He could literally smell his destination just a few paces ahead. The boy considered finding an alternate entrance, but he deemed it too risky with so many monsters about. He picked up the box of eyes and thought about how they might be able to help him. Perhaps he could use the golden eyes to transport himself to the other side. He opened the lid, and as he did, his hand was drawn toward a pair in back. Peter began to scoop them up, but when his fingertips met their surface, he gasped and pulled away. Those were not the golden eyes. Peter swallowed and reached into the box once more. Again, as if by magnetic force, his hand was pulled toward the same pair. He ran his fingertips over their slick, grainless texture and shivered with dread. There was no question. He was supposed to use the black eyes. If you recall, Peter's last experience with this particular set of enchanted eyes had left a salty taste in his mouth. Had it not been for Sir Toad's judicious knock upside the head, Peter would most certainly have suffocated right there in the desert. But this time seemed to be different. This time, the eyes were calling to him. Terrified as he was, Peter knew deep down that he must answer. He lifted the black pair from their eggshells and closed the lid. "All right, you two," he said. "I'll give you another chance. But you better promise not to kill me." The eyes maintained a worrisome silence. Peter slid the box beneath the nearby plinth and faced the gate. Plinth. P-L-I-N-T-H. You guys need to look that up. P-L-I-N-T-H. Peter slid the box behind a nearby plinth and faced the gate. He untied his bandage and took a deep breath. He slipped the eyes into his sockets and blinked. This time Peter did not stop breathing, nor did he hear the sound of water. Instead, as he opened his lids, he felt his feet and hands grow rigid. The ground beneath him began to transform, expanding into a great rocky canyon. "Oh, what's happening to me?" he shouted. But his voice came out small and weak. Peter still couldn't see a thing. He was blind as ever, but his whole body felt different somehow. His fingers were useless. He couldn't even tell what they were touching. Moreover, he had an awful taste in his mouth. What was that? Was he licking the ground? Wait, it wasn't his mouth at all. It was his feet. He could taste the floor with his feet. Peter skittered about, trying to gain his bearings, but the corridor had grown enormous. No matter how far he ran, the huge wall never seemed to get any closer. "What did these eyes do to me?" he clicked, extending his antenna. "Ah!" Peter screamed, realizing that he did in fact have antenna. For the great thief had just been transformed into a shiny black beetle. Being a beetle took some getting used to. Peter was not accustomed to running so much just to cover a small distance. On top of that, his blindness was even more difficult to manage. He suddenly had to get used to a whole new set of senses, different taste, different touch, different hearing, and he had no sense of smell whatsoever. Soon, however, he had figured out how to feel his way around with his feet and to understand what his antennae were telling him. Given his change in size, the gate no longer posed a problem. Peter crawled right beneath the iron bars and was soon on the other side. He scuttled into a shadow and plucked out the fantastic eyes with his forelegs. Within seconds, Peter Nimble was a little boy again. He tied the bandage around his head and tucked the black eyes safely into his trousers pocket, contemplating what had just occurred. The golden pear made him transport. This pear made him transform. But why a beetle? Why on earth would Professor Cake give Peter such a strange ability? He thought back to when he tried to use the eyes in the Just Deserts. Sir Toad had said Peter's body was transforming then too, but in a different way. His skin had gone clammy and he couldn't breathe. Whatever the answer, the boy knew there was more to this pear than met the eyes. Dum-dum-shh. Peter entered the eating hall and discovered that it too had been transformed. The place was an utter disaster. Food and dishes were scattered everywhere. Gravy boats and crocks of pork pudding had already gone bad. The boy wrinkled his nose as he stepped between congealing cream balls and pools of cheddar brine. The bitterness he'd noticed while eating had become stronger. He could now smell it wafting up from every overturned plate. Who could have made this mess? He breathed to himself. Then he remembered the state of panic that had overcome all the people when the great bell struck. He cast an ear upward, listening for a moment of the clock's hands, but he heard only a steady grinding. The master thief picked his way across the floor until he came to a tiny bird nestled atop a stone pedestal, sleeping soundly. If the monster carried Sir Toad past this hall, then perhaps these birds could tell him where they went. He remembered hearing a faint jingling sound accompanying the birds during supper. Exploring with his fingers, he discovered that the creature's ankles was fixed with a tiny gold shackle and chain. Were the birds being held prisoner? "Pardon me," he whispered. "I need your help." The bird jolted awake, flapping and shouting, "The perfect morn has come at last!" Peter pinched his tiny beak shut before it could wake the others. Still the creature muffled its way through the second line. "Let's praise our king and break the fast." The bird was clearly terrified and struggled with all of its might to break free from his grip. Peter could feel the animal's little bird heartbeat racing impossibly fast as it flapped in his hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He tried running a finger along the bird's nape. He wasn't sure whether birds even had napes, but the trick seemed to help. Slowly, the creature calmed itself. "Why is it dark?" It finally spoke. Peter could now tell by the voice and the short feathers that this bird was a girl. "Because morning hasn't come yet," he said. "I'm here for information." The little bird began to shake. "I haven't seen a thing. Long live our—" Peter pinched her beak shut again. He was afraid all this singing would wake the other birds, or worse, draw the attention of whatever monsters were wandering the halls. "I'm not with the king," he said. "I'm here to set you and your friends free, but I need you to be quiet. Otherwise, we both might get caught." The bird stopped protesting. I saw you at supper. You're the visitor, Mr. Trousers." "I am." Peter wiggled his fingernail into the tiny lock, popping it open. "But my real name is Peter Nimble." "Pickle Sparrow." She curtsied, stretching her newly freed leg. "Pleased to meet you, Pickle. I was hoping you could answer some questions for me about this place." The bird considered this for a moment. "First set my sisters free," she said firmly. Peter snuck around to all the other birds and unfastened the latches around their ankles. There were 12 sparrows in all. Roused from slumber, each bird instantly began to sing, but just as Pickle had done. She did her best to quiet them and explain the situation. When they learned that the stranger had opened their shackles, they stopped singing and looked at Peter with great awe. With a neat curtsy, for they all were girl birds, each sparrow chirped her thanks and fluttered off into the night. Once her sisters were safely away, Pickle hopped back onto Peter's palm. "We don't have much time till the night patrol arrives," she said. "What would you like to know?" Peter had learned from his time with old scabs that the best way to interrogate someone was to make every question about that individual. There's nothing people like to do more than talk about themselves. "I want to know why you're chained up like this," he said. The bird stretched her wings. "We're chained up here because the king doesn't want us to escape." While that was the usual reason for locking someone up, Peter couldn't imagine how it was worth the trouble. What possible threat could these little sparrows pose to a king? "Why doesn't he want you to escape? Is he afraid of you?" "Oh, yes," she leaned close. "He thinks we might fly off and fetch help." "And we will, too," she said, pluming herself proudly, "even if the journey kills us." Peter marveled at this little bird's courage. "When I was at supper last night, the big clock went off and everyone started running about. Why?" I do not know what a clock is, sir, but every night and every morning the king works a great magic bell. It's for their own safety. The people have to clear the corridors before the night patrol comes." As she finished speaking, Peter heard a roar echo from a nearby terrace. The bird loosed a terrified chirp, nestling herself deep into the boy's palm. "That's them now." The night patrol. Those must be the monsters he had heard earlier. Peter could tell they were working their way toward the eating hall. There wasn't much time left. "What exactly is the night patrol?" he asked. "Oh, they're horrible, sir. They could gobble you up, feathers and all. That's why the people's doors get locked at night, so the night patrol won't get them. Anyone wandering the halls after curfew is fair game. If the night patrol sees you flapping about, the most you can pray for is that they'll make it swift." Peter thought that this night patrol sounded rather similar to Pencil Cookson and his Mumbledy Peg gang, only much, much worse. "You're saying the night patrol works for the king?" "Oh, of course they do. They're the king's personal army. Only he's no king. He's a tyrant. He keeps all of his subjects under lock and latch and makes us say we love him. And if anyone disagrees, he sends the night patrol to their door. And worst of all," her voice fell to a peep, "he's made them all forget." Peter was running out of time. He could now make out the sounds of scraping, clinking footsteps approaching from the hall. "I need you to be very clear with me, Pickle. What has made them forget?" "Not what. Who?" she said. "The locks on the doors aren't just there to keep people safe. It's to keep people from getting out and seeing the missing ones." It was just as Peter had suspected. If the locks had been only for protection, then it would have been possible to open them from the inside. The king was hiding something he didn't want them to see. These missing ones, who are they? "Well, that's the one thing missing in this whole place." "Oh, sorry, no. Well, what's the one thing missing in this whole place?" "The one thing that every kingdom needs, but isn't in the palace." "I don't know, dirt," he stammered. "Why don't you just tell me?" Pickle shook her tiny head and hopped back. He was afraid they'd outwit him. He knows how clever they can be. So instead, he locked up every last one. And before she could finish, she gave a shriek. The little bird leapt from Peter's hand and fluttered into the air. "Locked up all the what?" Peter called after her. But it was too late. Pickle had disappeared. "Hoy!" a voice roared directly behind him. "Who goes there?" Dun, dun, dun. So that was the end of chapter 15. See you guys tomorrow.